Today marks my first State of the Union address to you, a constitutional duty as old as our republic itself. President Washington began this tradition in 1790 after reminding the nation that the destiny of self-government and the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty is finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. For our friends in the press who place a high premium on accuracy, let me say, I did not actually hear George Washington say that.
After watching the State of the Union address the other night, I'm reminded of the old adage that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Only in this case, it's not flattery, but grand larceny.
And we'll be back in just a second to show you how Reagan has remained remarkably consistent throughout his life on his principal beliefs. We'll show you that right after this break. Don't go away.
Looking back, I know that we lived in poverty or pretty close to it all the time. But we didn't know that at the time because the government didn't come around and tell us we were poor.
The trouble with our liberal friends is not that they're ignorant. It's just that they know so much that isn't so.
Now, is that not true? Now, see, now that's diplomacy here. He's just called them a bunch of idiots, but in a way that they wouldn't understand or maybe even wouldn't be offended by. Now, we want to show you some contrasts. We have some clips from Reagan's famous 1964 speech that he gave for Barry Goldwater, and some other speeches that he's given later on, his 1981 inaugural address, the 84 inaugural address, State of the Union address, some things during the 1980s. And you'll see a remarkable consistency of belief. You'll even hear some of the same lines used. And your first reaction might be, well, he's just repeating the old thing. Why did he say something new? And the thing you ought to realize is this is representative of a principled, consistent set of values. And this is the simplicity and the brilliance of Ronald Reagan. You Republicans that are running for president and Republican Congress can learn a lot from here. You don't hear him talking about, well, we need a 7-year balanced budget scored by a CBO and make sure that the upside works on the downside, look at the outside and the inside. There's none of this complicated rhetoric. It's just simple philosophy aimed at every American's heart. Here is Reagan talking about the growth of government from 1964.
No government ever voluntarily reduces itself in size. So government programs once launched never disappear. Actually, a government bureau is the nearest thing to eternal life we'll ever see on this earth.
Now, another comment. This is from 1984, in January, the State of the Union address, and it's on the same subject, the growth of government.
It's just the tendency of government to grow, for practices and programs to become the nearest thing to eternal life we'll ever see on this earth. And there's always that well-intentioned chorus of voices saying, with a little more power and a little more money, we could do so much for the people. For a time, we forgot the American dream isn't one of making government bigger. It's keeping faith with the mighty spirit of free people under God.
That is remarkable, consistency and simplicity, but it cuts right to the essence of the matter. Easily understood and agreed with, or to, by most people. Now, here's another contrast, and this is about the government spending deficits, the tax burden. Again, we go to 1964 and the famous Goldwater speech.
But I have an uncomfortable feeling that this prosperity isn't something on which we can base our hopes for the future. No nation in history has ever survived a tax burden that reached 1/3 of its national income. Today, 37 cents out of every dollar earned in this country is the tax collector's share. And yet our government continues to spend $17 million a day more than the government takes in. We haven't balanced our budget 28 out of the last 34 years. We've raised our debt limit 3 times in the last 12 months. And now our national debt is 1.5 times bigger than all the combined debts of all the nations of the world.
Now we'll move forward to 1981, 17 years later, an inaugural address, same subject.
But great as our tax burden is, it has not kept pace with public spending. For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future for the temporary convenience of the present. To continue this long trend is to guarantee tremendous social, cultural, political, and economic upheavals. You and I, as individuals, can, by borrowing, live beyond our means, but for only a limited period of time. Why then should we think that collectively, as a nation, we're not bound by that same limitation? We must act today in order to preserve tomorrow.
And we'll be back and show you more right after this break. Please stay with us.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
It is time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten our punitive tax burden. And these will be our first priorities, and on these principles there will be no compromise.
Well, there you have it, folks. That's from the 1981 inaugural address when he was spelling out what he intended to do. And boy, he stuck to it. He had 3 things. He was going to build up the U.S. military, rebuild it from the debacle of the Carter years. He was going to lower taxes and defeat communism. Just 3 things. Did them. A, B, C, and D. Just frightened the liberals to death. Said he was going to do it, and he did it, despite them. And he did it with, and I don't mean to overemphasize this, but the simplicity of the philosophy made it easy for everybody to understand and identify with. It's a marked difference from the way the Republicans are trying to sell things now. Too much green eye shade detail. Here, one more pair of contrasts. 1964, government is not the solution to our problems, from the Goldwater speech.
And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government, or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves.
And let's look at the same contrast, same statement. This is from the 1981 State of the Union address.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. From time to time, we've been tempted to believe that society has become too complex to be managed by self-rule, that government by an elite group is superior to government for, by, and of the people. But if no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else?
We'll be right back after this. Please stay.